Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our Budget 101 webinar. My name is Jason Warner, and I am the Director of Strategic Engagement with the Greater Ohio Policy Center. I'm excited to have you with us this morning as we will be briefly discussing the process to enact the state budget here in the state of Ohio. Before we begin, some housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within the next 24 hours for the benefit of those of you who may have to leave the presentation early or who are unable to make it this morning. Because the session is being recorded, we ask that you please remain muted throughout the presentation and pose any questions that you might have in the chat. I am being assisted today with the webinar by my colleague Casey Terry, who will be monitoring the chat and forwarding questions to me for our end of presentation Q&A. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is designed to provide a 101 level introduction to the process that will play out over the next several months to enact Ohio's operational budgets, including the transportation and main operating budgets. Once we have concluded the presentation, there will be time at the end for questions. We ask that you submit those in the chat. Before we begin, a little background about myself and GOPC. Greater Ohio Policy Center is Ohio's champion for revitalization. We work every day to improve the communities of Ohio through smart growth strategies and research to achieve our vision of a revitalized Ohio. This work can be broken down into 4 areas of work, all of which are impacted by the state budget process. These include brownfield remediation, transportation innovation, legacy city renewal, housing improvements, and neighborhood revitalization. As for me, I have the privilege of serving as Greater Ohio's Director of Strategic Engagement. In my role, I am tasked with overseeing GOPC's communications work, as well as leading our advocacy efforts at the Ohio State House. While I have been with GOPC for over 8 years now, I have worked in and around Ohio state government since 2003. In that time, I have worked on 11 state budgets, 6 transportation budgets, 10 capital budgets, and recently have worked to secure $1 billion in funding for brownfield remediation work and residential demolition funding over the past 2 state budget cycles, as well as one of the largest increases in public transportation funding in a generation. Now, over the next 6 months, Ohio lawmakers will work to pass 4 different budgets, which will provide funding for 2 years for a variety of programs, fund state government operations and capital projects, as well as enact a number of law and policy changes within those documents. A total of 6 budgets are typically enacted by the state during any given 2-year legislative cycle. These budgets are generally the only opportunity to secure program funding during a 2-year legislative cycle. Standalone bills that include programmatic funding are very rare, and the next 6 months are the only real shot at securing funding for any priority projects you may be working towards. These budgets include the transportation budget, which allocates Ohio's motor fuel tax and licensing fees for highway infrastructure projects, as well as the State Highway Patrol. The main operating budget, which funds general government operations, primarily from sales tax and income tax revenue, as well as budgets for the Ohio BWC and Ohio Industrial Commissions, which are based on fees paid by businesses to belong to those entities. The capital appropriations and reappropriations budgets will not be enacted until next year. Today's presentation will focus on 2 budgets which most directly impact Ohioans, the transportation and main operating budgets. Briefly, though we are not taking a closer look at them today, I do want to mention the 2 other budgets lawmakers must enact this year, the BWC and Ohio Industrial Commission budgets. The funds allocated in these budgets are from fees that are paid by Ohio businesses to belong either to the BWC or IC. These funds go into separate funds managed by the state and therefore require their own independent budgets to have the revenues allocated to run these 2 important state agencies. The process involved is usually very low key and without controversy, but occasionally, such as 4 years ago, issues do arise and the budgets may miss the statutory enactment deadline. Like the other budgets we will discuss today, they must both be enacted before July 1st. However, unlike the transportation budget, which we'll discuss momentarily, they can be passed as emergency measures to negate the need for a 90-day effective period. Finally, the capital budgets, which will not be enacted until next year. These both are passed to provide funding for the acquisition, construction, equipment, or renovation of buildings and other facilities of government agencies, except the Department of Transportation, and include projects at the county and local level funded through state agencies. The reappropriations budget is to reauthorize the use of funds for projects that are underway and have not yet been completed, while the capital budget is for new projects. We'll discuss both the capital appropriations and reappropriations budgets later this year in a webinar that we will once again host here on the Zoom platform. And I'll encourage you to sign up for those webinars when they become available to learn more about that process. So let us begin with the state transportation budget. The transportation budget provides funding for the Ohio Department of Transportation, as well as some funding for the Ohio Department of Public Safety and the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Like the main operating budget, the transportation budget often includes a number of law and policy changes related to safety, such as adjusting speed limits, regulating freight weight, or prohibiting texting while driving. One unique feature of the transportation budget is that it cannot be passed as an emergency measure. It requires a 90-day effective date, similar to most legislation passed by the legislature. Therefore, the transportation budget must be passed by March 31st in order for it to become effective at the start of the next state fiscal year on July 1st. Other provisions, such as changes in state law that may set an effective date that are later than July 1st. For example, if there is a proposal to raise or lower speed limits on Ohio's highways, the legislature could provide for an additional time to phase in this new requirement, say until January 1st, 2026, in order to provide ODOT time to prepare and install new signage on states' roadways. The primary source of revenue in the state transportation budget is the state motor fuel tax. This provides over $3 billion in revenue for the Department of Transportation, over 51% of ODOT's budget. Additionally, the transportation budget also includes almost $2.5 billion in federal motor fuel tax funds. Other revenue sources in the transportation budget include motor vehicle registration fees and licensing fees. This revenue generally provides operating support for the Ohio Department of Public Safety and the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Now, this is an issue that comes up time to time every 2 years, but it does bear repeating. The Ohio Constitution mandates that Ohio's motor fuel tax can only fund roadway construction and maintenance. It cannot be applied to any other uses within the Department of Transportation. Because the motor fuel tax can only be used on roadway maintenance and construction, beginning in 2019, an appropriation of general revenue funds was made in the transportation budget to fund public transportation. That budget saw a total of $140 million allocated for public transportation over the 2-year budget cycle. While that number has been reduced in the most recent state transportation budget, it was substituted with federal motor fuel tax revenue Ohio receives that does not have the same restrictions state motor fuel tax revenue does. The federal highway funding that Ohio receives is more flexible in its use and has in the past been applied to a number of uses within the ODOT budget. Other appropriations within the transportation budget include rail maintenance, airport improvements and maintenance, as well as paying down debt or repaying bonds that Ohio has taken out to pay for infrastructure projects. The process of enacting the transportation budget, due to the requirements of the 90-day effective period, is one of the quickest on the legislative calendar. The process will kick off next week when Governor Mike DeWine and the Ohio Department of Transportation present a spending proposal to the General Assembly for the next 2 years. The governor's proposal is likely to not only include spending proposals, but also changes to state law that affect transportation, such as the governor's call last year to require that those over the age of 18 take a driver's education training before they can receive a temporary learner's permit or driver's license. The General Assembly will mark the first time in recent years that the initial work passing the transportation budget will not be done in the House Finance Committee, but instead the House Transportation Committee.
Hello?
Previously, the Department of Transportation's Department of Public Safety and the Ohio State Highway Patrol would testify before the full Finance Committee before additional work was handled by the Transportation Subcommittee. The new Speaker of the House, Matt Huffman, has announced that the state will not have subcommittees, but instead, full standing committees will be involved in the budget process. This will see the House Transportation Committee undertake the primary work of reviewing the executive budget proposal, taking testimony from state agencies, advocacy organizations, and the public, and developing a House budget proposal before the bill is reported and sent to the Finance Committee for final approval of appropriations. This committee process will see two different transportation spending proposals. One in the form of a substitute bill, which outlines initial spending proposals and the legal updates by the House, followed shortly thereafter by an omnibus amendment, which is a collection of changes made by members of the committee that impact spending and changes to state law. The omnibus amendment typically includes amendments proposed by members of the majority party. Members of the minority will then have their own amendments, some of which will be accepted, most of which will be tabled. The bill will then be reported and sent to the full House of Representatives for consideration. Final passage of the House version of the transportation budget should occur by the end of February. The process in the Senate will be very similar to what we see happen in the House. The Senate Transportation Committee will lead efforts to review the proposal from the administration, and the House of Representatives take testimony and develop their own version of spending priorities and policy changes. Like the House, a substitute bill and omnibus amendments will be accepted. Members of the minority will have the chance to offer amendments that may or likely may not be accepted by the majority. Once the amendment process is wrapped up, the full Senate is expected to pass the Senate version of the transportation budget sometime by mid-March. There are now two different scenarios which will happen next. Typically, because there are likely to be major differences between the two budgets, it may be necessary to send the budget to a conference committee. Should the House vote to reject the Senate version of the budget, the Senate will vote to insist on their changes and move to create a committee on conference to work out the differences between the two bills. The conference committee will consist of members of both the House and the Senate, with 3 from each chamber, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, who will be the formal negotiators. In practice, most of the negotiation will go on behind the scenes and will be between the leadership in both the House and the Senate. While the conference committee is supposed to be limited to negotiating the differences between the two bills, it is not unheard of for these negotiations to also ultimately include new provisions that were never a part of the budget prior to the conference committee, or significantly altered versions of proposals that did at one point appear in the bill. Once negotiations are completed, the conference committee will vote to approve a conference report that then goes to the House and Senate to vote on, outlining the final agreement upon the versions of the budget. This will occur by March 31st. Now, a conference committee is not a given. In 2021, members of the House and Senate majority leadership debated differences between the House version and the Senate version while the proposals were being written behind closed doors. And then the House later voted to simply concur with the Senate version of the bill. This is rare in the budget process, but it could happen in 2025 due to the unusual situation of the leaders of the House and Senate being close political allies. The Speaker of the House was just 1 month ago president of the Ohio Senate, and the current Senate president was a member of the Speaker's Senate leadership team. Again, we do not expect this to be the situation. It is very rare, but it is something to keep an eye on. Now, should that happen, the bill would bypass conference committee and move directly on to step number 5. The final version of the budget is sent to Governor DeWine for his approval. Now, the governor's team will be part of the budget negotiation throughout the legislative process, including the conference committee. The governor must sign the bill by April 1st for the 90-day effective period to take place. when the bill arrives at the governor's desk for signature, the governor can exercise his line item veto power. Now, if you do not know what the line item veto is, which is different from any of the governor's general veto powers, briefly, it is the ability for the governor to essentially cross out language in any legislation that includes a budget appropriation, including funding that he disagrees with. These vetoes must include a detailed reason of why the governor has declined to allow this final language to be in the budget. The line item veto can be applied to any policy changes or funding and allows the governor to delete certain provisions from the budget while approving the overall package so that the funding may continue for general functions outlined in the budget. Now, the governor does not have final say over this, however. As with any veto, the legislature can vote to override a governor's line item veto by a 3/5 vote in both chambers. In the House, this requires 60 votes, while in the Senate, this requires 20. It bears noting, however, that the last two transportation budgets have been approved by the governor without any use of his line item veto power. Now, while the House is working on the transportation budget, primarily in the Transportation Committee, the Finance Committee will simultaneously be working on the main operating budget. The main operating budget provides funding for most state agencies, boards, and commissions, the state legislature, as well as the judiciary. The budget must be enacted by June 30th because, again, the next state fiscal year begins on July 1st. The Ohio Constitution sets out that spending bills like the budget that provide for tax levies and appropriations for current expenses of state government and state institutions can be passed without a 90-day effective period. Other provisions in the bill, specifically the law and policy changes, take effect after either 90 days or on dates specified in the legislation. The main operating budget contains revenue from multiple sources, including the sales and use tax, income tax, cigarette tax, public utilities tax, business taxes, lottery profits, and license and registration fees from state agencies. The sales and use tax and income tax constitutes the largest source of revenue in the budget. In 2025, it is estimated that this will account for almost 46% of states' general revenue fund. Total expenditures in 2025, as budgeted, were $29.46 billion, excluding federal funds. Medicaid and K-12 education are the two largest spending categories in the entire state budget. Together, these categories, which do include federal funds, account for 77% of state appropriations, which, with all other areas, including health and human services, higher education, corrections, and general government, accounting for a combined 23%. Like the transportation budget, the main operating budget is passed to cover a 2-year period, referred to as a biennium, and again, Ohio is currently operating under fiscal year 2025. The next budget, beginning on July 1st, will begin fiscal year 2026. The main operating budget has increasingly become a tool for the enactment of laws and policy changes not directly related to the budget. Part of this is due to the fact that the budget is one of the pieces of legislation that the state must pass every year. It also provides an opportunity for lawmakers that have policy changes inserted into the budget anonymously, while the sheer size of the budget allows some changes to be implemented with little to no notice. Like all appropriations bills, however, these changes are still subject to the governor's line item veto. Like the transportation budget, the main operating budget, which kicks off next week, begins with the release of the governor's executive budget proposal, known as the Blue Book, by Governor DeWine. The Blue Book, called this because the original hard copies presented to the General Assembly had a blue cover, outlines the proposed spending proposals by Ohio's various state agencies, boards, commissions, as well as other statewide entities, including the Ohio General Assembly, Ohio Supreme Court, Ohio statewide elected officials, and the State Board of Education. As with the transportation budget, the process in the legislature will begin in the House of Representatives. The House Finance Committee begins the process with hearings featuring the directors of the Office of Budget Management and the director of the Ohio Legislative Service Commission, providing testimony explaining the finances behind the budget and answering questions about the process involved in developing the budget proposal. From there, standing committees will take testimony from all state agencies, boards, and commissions, as well as testimony from the general public. As previously noted, the House will not use subcommittees of the Finance Committee this year and will instead rely on full standing committees to do this work. Some committees will hear testimony from certain agencies, like the Department of Agriculture will be appearing before the House Agriculture Committee. Others will be something of a grab bag, although a committee like the General Government Committee could be responsible for hearings from a variety of state boards and commissions that do not fit the criteria of general standing committees. Committees will hear testimony and then provide reports back to the full Finance Committee, where a substitute bill followed by a majority-produced omnibus amendment and minority-supported standalone amendments will be offered. The committee will send the bill to the full House of Representatives, where it is expected to be voted on by either late April or early May. Once the committee work is completed, the bill goes to the full House of Representatives, where members will debate the merits of the spending provisions, changes proposed in state law, and offer additional amendments that may or may not be accepted. The House version of the budget should be passed by no later than early May, sending the budget process over to the Ohio Senate. Over in the Senate, like the transportation budget, preliminary hearings will get underway in late April while the House is wrapping up its work on their version of the budget. This work will be undertaken by the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate is expected to follow the model for passing the budget, which originated there 4 years ago, with the Senate Finance Committee leading the work, while the process of taking agency testimony will be farmed out to some of the body's standing committees. As in the House, the full Finance Committee will prepare a substitute bill, followed by a majority-produced omnibus amendment and minority-supported standalone amendments, which will be offered. The committee will send the bill to the full Senate, where it is expected to be voted on by mid-June. The Senate will debate the budget. Final changes will be proposed during floor debate, and the Senate version is expected to pass by no later than June 20th. It is likely that the House will then reject the Senate version of the budget, necessitating a conference committee to work out the differences between the now 3 versions of the budget. The conference committee will officially negotiate the differences between the 3 budget proposals, the executive, the House passed, and the Senate passed. However, behind the scenes, the work will primarily involve the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the chairs of the Finance Committee in the House and Senate, and the governor and members of the governor's team. They will negotiate a final budget agreement that will then go to the full House and Senate for their approval, sending the final budget proposal to the governor for final approval and enactment. All of this must be completed by June 30th, the final day of the current fiscal year, in order to ensure that state government continues to operate at the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Governor DeWine will be presented with the budget for his signature, which will happen by midnight on June 30th, but not before he uses the line item veto power to exclude provisions he does not want to include in the final budget. I mentioned before that he did not issue any line item vetoes in the last 2 transportation budgets. However, in 2023, Governor DeWine did use his veto power on more than 40 provisions in the budget prior to giving his final assent. Any provisions that the governor does veto then become subject to the legislature's power to override that veto, which requires a 3/5 vote in both chambers, 60 votes in the House, 20 votes in the Senate. This most recently occurred last year when the House and Senate overrode the governor's veto of a state preemption law that forbid local governments from banning the sale of flavored tobacco products. This brings me to the last area that we are focusing on today as part of the budget process. What happens if the legislature misses the deadline to enact a budget? Now, not passing a budget by midnight happens all the time. Back in the day, it was not unheard of for lawmakers to put a piece of paper over the clock in the House and Senate chambers and ignore the time to complete the work on the budget. But in more extreme circumstances, passage of the budget goes well beyond midnight and takes days or even weeks to resolve the differences. Most recently, disagreement between the House and the Senate in 2023 resulted in the passage of what is called a continuance budget. That year, the legislature approved a 7-day continuation budget that provided funding at the same level as fiscal year 2023 budget from July 1st through July 7th of 2023. This provided lawmakers more time to work out differences in the budget while also ensuring that government continued to operate as usual. In 2019, lawmakers similarly missed the deadline and passed a 17-day budget extension. 10 years earlier, in 2009, divided government in the midst of the Great Recession resulted in the need to pass 3 one-week continuance budgets while negotiations between the House, Senate, and then Governor Ted Strickland continued past July 1st. Those budgets provided funding at 70% of the funding from fiscal year 2009, leading to some staff and agencies being closed partially during this period. The reduction in funding was due to significant losses in state revenue resulting from the recession and the need to plug the state budget deficiencies to ensure a balanced state budget. During the session, continuance budgets were amended into other legislation that was already posed to move in either the House or the Senate. I know this because one of the pieces of legislation I was working on at the time as a legislative aide ended up being passed as a one-week continuance budget to operate state government for the 3rd week of July in 2009. Now, as we are about 96 hours away from the budget actually being introduced, it is hard to predict if we will see a continuance budget this year, though it's probably unlikely. No one likes to having to take this route, but as I have said before, we should never say never when it comes to what can and cannot happen at the Ohio State House. So with that, we have covered a lot of material this morning, but I do want to open the chat to see if you have any questions about the state budget process. Well, as I'm not seeing any questions come in, that fills me with confidence that I've covered everything in a way that everyone has been easily able to understand and digest. I'll go ahead and give it one more minute. Okay, we do have one question that's come in. What is the budget outlook? That is a very good question as we are on the eve of the introduction of the budget. Our anticipation as we're moving towards this budget process is that we're likely going to be heading into a period of austerity. The Ohio Office of Budget and Management has indicated that state revenue forecasts are meeting expectations as they were presented 2 years ago at the kickoff of that budget process. However, unlike the last 2 budget cycles, we are not seeing an unusual influx of additional federal spending to assist state government in order to keep the budget strong. In 2021 and 2023, there were a number of pieces of legislation that were passed in Congress that provided for an influx of federal funding that allowed the state to spend significantly increased areas that affected a number of budget programs. That includes the state brownfield program, which Greater Ohio has been advocating for the last several years. So while we're not expecting there to be draconian cuts to programs, we are still approaching this process with the expectation that there are going to be smaller amounts of revenue to work with, and it may be necessary to scale back some funding requests for budget line items as we are beginning that process. All I can say at this point is stay tuned. These things are very fluid. Even when the budget process can kick off, what we'll see is what the initial revenue forecast is in February when the governor introduces his budget. Could look very different as we are entering the final stages of the budget process in June. That's what happened in 2009. We thought that there would be more money when we got towards the end of the budget process. It proved not to be the case, and so it was necessary to make significant spending reductions. In 2021, we saw exactly the opposite, where we got to the end of that budget process in June, and the state discovered that they had about $500 million more than they anticipated that they were going to have when the budget process started. And so they were able to create some significant one-time investments in that budget in order to keep government operations going. So we'll have to wait and see, but at this point, we are anticipating something of an austerity budget process. The next question that I have is, how do school vouchers affect the budget? Are they over budget again, using a greater share of state funds than originally estimated? So I've had a few conversations with folks that operate in this space. This is not an area that Greater Ohio is focused on. My understanding is that the estimates of what is being spent on that particular line item are in line with about where the budget forecast was when the budget was written 2 years ago. We're going to have to wait and see if the legislature makes any additional changes to that program that could further increase the amount of revenue that is going to support that particular line item. But again, with any budget process, it is always very fluid. There are a lot of things that will change, and that will also be dictated by the policy changes that the legislature decides to make in this budget process. If, for instance, they decide to expand the amounts of those vouchers, that could significantly increase the amount of revenue that it is going to cost to keep that going. So we'll just have to wait and see exactly what ends up happening ultimately with that line item and other line items as well. So we don't have any other questions. I'll go ahead and give about another minute or so if anyone has any additional questions. When is the right time? So we do have another one. When is the right time to ask for earmarks, and can GOPC help? So that's a very good question. And earmarks are something that we don't often talk about, but they are things that do happen throughout the budget process. I will say that earmarks are a rare occurrence in the main operating budget, where earmarks are absolute thing is when you're talking about the capital budget. That is more likely where you will see things that are a particular pet project for a legislator that will get inserted, because those are paying for some of those capital projects. So if the legislature has something in the district that they are interested in, they will, work to make sure that that particular project is funded in their district. Generally speaking, when we're dealing with the operating budgets, as the main operating and transportation budget are, those will be a programmatic funding line item. Earmarks can happen for a specific project, however, if there is a pilot project, for example, that you are looking to fund that could affect a certain city, region, or county. You will sometimes see those get funded throughout the budget process. It is never the wrong time to start talking with legislators if you are interested in having a particular project that you are interested in funded in the budget. You should begin having those conversations as soon as you can, reaching out to members of the Finance Committee, as well as your individual legislators if it's something that is specific to their district or their region in the General Assembly. Every single member of the legislature has the opportunity to propose amendments for the budget. Certainly, the Finance Committee has more of a role in that process, given their role in hearing testimony and being involved in writing the budget. But every single member of the legislature has the opportunity to propose amendments to the budget. They work with the Legislative Service Commission to draft those amendments. They get filed with the finance committees in both the House and the Senate. They have an opportunity to review those and decide, A, is there money available? And B, do we have the means of being able to fund this project for the next 2 years? So I would, if you're not already having conversations with your legislators, I would definitely begin that process so you can begin to work through exactly what it is that you're looking for and how much they might be able to appropriate for that. Depending upon what type of an earmark it is that you are looking for, Greater Ohio could be able to assist you with that. We try to limit all of the work that we do to things that align with our budget priorities and our policy agenda, which is approved by our board every 2 years. But if it is something that you'd like to share with us, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and we can see what we can do to possibly give you some assistance with that. I'll go ahead and give about another minute or so if there are any other questions that folks want to go ahead and submit in the chat. So it looks like we are probably through with all of our questions. So I appreciate those of you that did go ahead and submit. So we're going to go ahead and close. And I do want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us this morning for this webinar. I hope that you have gained a better insight into the state budget process and know what to watch and expect for over the next 6 months. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me directly here at the office at 614-224-0187 or via email. My email address is jwarner@greaterohio.org. I would also encourage you, if you do not already, to follow Greater Ohio on social media. We have transitioned to Blue Sky, and I would encourage you, if you are on that platform, to go ahead and give us a follow. We'll also share a great deal of information about our work on LinkedIn. Again, if you are there, go ahead and give us a follow, and we will be providing up-to-date information about as the budget process gets underway. Both of those accounts are listed on the screen, and we'll be providing continuous updates about the budget process, often in real time on those websites. Likewise, we have updated our bill tracker on our website for the 136th General Assembly, and we provide weekly updates on the state budget process and all of the other bills that are going through impacting GOPC's work at the State House. As a reminder, if you missed anything in the webinar this morning, it will be posted on our website by early next week. And once again, thank you for joining us today. I hope that everyone has a great rest of their day and an enjoyable weekend.